"I am afraid you have misunderstood the nature of our arrangement," Charlotte Beaumont said, standing very straight in the middle of her father's drawing room. "If you believed I would weep." The man across from her, Mr. Henry Fanshawe, who had, until 11 o'clock that morning, been her betrothed of 2 years' standing, shifted his weight and looked at the carpet. He was a comfortable-looking young man of good family and better prospects, and he had come to tell her, with every appearance of reluctance and not one grain of it in his heart, that he could not marry her after all. "You must see how it is, Charlotte," he said. "Miss Prescott's father has £30,000. 30,000. A man in my position cannot simply, one has obligations, to Miss Prescott's £30,000. Yes, you have made your obligations quite clear." Charlotte kept her voice level. It cost her something to keep it level, but she would have bitten through her own tongue before she let him see the cost. "You needn't trouble yourself further, Mr. Fanshawe. I release you. I release you gladly. Please give Miss Prescott and her £30,000 my very sincere congratulations." He had the grace to flush at least, but he did not have the grace to stay, and within the quarter hour he was gone, and Charlotte Beaumont stood alone in her father's shabby genteel drawing room. The ring returned to her palm. The 2 years of her life he had wasted returned to no one, and the great cold fact of her position settling around her like snow. She was 25. She had no fortune to speak of. Her father, a scholarly clergyman with more books than sense, had spent what little there was on the education of a son now dead in the Indies. She had given the best years of a woman's marriageable life to Henry Fanshawe, waiting on his convenience and his prospects, and he had thrown her over the moment a richer girl smiled at him. Within a week the whole of the county would know it. The Beaumont girl, jilted for an heiress, poor thing. Past her bloom too. What a pity. Charlotte did not weep. She was in this, not unlike a certain distant duchess she had never heard of, and never would. She came of a stubborn stock, and she had learned young that tears were a currency the world would gladly take from you and give you nothing for. Instead she went to the window and looked out at the grey autumn garden, and she thought, with a cold clarity that frightened her a little, that she could not stay. Not here, not in this parish, not to be pitied at every tea-table and prayed over from every pew. She would go mad. She would rather be a governess in Scotland. She would rather be anything, anywhere, than the jilted Beaumont girl for the rest of her natural life. It was her aunt who provided the escape, and though no one on earth could have guessed it, the whole of the rest of Charlotte's life. Aunt Mercer was her mother's sister, a brisk and worldly widow who lived in the north and disapproved of nearly everything, and who arrived 3 days after the jilting with a great deal of luggage and a proposition. "You will come to me at Ashworth," she announced over the wreckage of the tea-things. "You will not sit here being pitied. It is bad for the complexion and worse for the temper. And it happens I have a use for you." She fixed Charlotte with a sharp eye. "There is a gentleman in the neighbourhood who wants a wife. Aunt, hear me out. He is a widower of good property, some years older than you, and by all accounts a difficult, silent, forbidding sort of man whom no one much likes and everyone respects. He does not go into society. He has been looking, in his cold, quiet way, for a sensible woman to run his house and be a companion of sorts. Nothing romantic, mind. He was very plain about that with the go-between. A marriage of arrangement, mutual convenience, a settled establishment for a woman who wants one." She paused. "It is not a love match. It will not be a love match. But you would be your own mistress in your own house, with money enough and no one to pity you, and you would never again have to sit at a table and watch a Henry Fanshawe choose £30,000 over your face. That, Charlotte, is worth a great deal more than romance, and at 25 with no fortune you are old enough to know it." Charlotte looked at her aunt for a long moment. "What is his name?" she asked. "Mr. Julian Ashby," said Aunt Mercer. "He keeps a place called Holstead, some way to the north, quiet as the grave and about as cheerful, from what I hear. But he pays his debts, he is kind to his people, and he has never in his life been known to say a thing he did not mean, which, after your Mr. Fanshawe, I should think you'd find restful." Restful. Charlotte turned the word over. A man who said only what he meant. A house of her own, far from every knowing eye. No love, but she had had love, or something wearing its clothes. and it had cost her 2 years and left her standing in a drawing room with a returned ring in her palm. She was not sure she wanted love. She was quite sure she wanted never to be pitied again. "Very well," she said. "I will meet your Mr. Ashby." She did not know, how could she have known, that Mr. Julian Ashby of Halstead was the name a very great man used when he wished, for a season, to be no one at all. She met him a fortnight later, in her aunt's own drawing-room at Ashworth, on a grey and blowing November afternoon. Charlotte had formed a picture. She had expected someone elderly and dry and vaguely apologetic, a dusty widower grateful for whatever plain, sensible woman would take pity on his loneliness. She had steeled herself to be gracious about it. The man who rose from her aunt's best chair when she entered was not that man. He was tall, very tall, and perhaps 40, though it was hard to say. There was something ageless about the stillness of him. He was dressed with a plainness so severe it circled back to elegance. Dark coat, no jewellery but a heavy signet ring, linen white as bone. His hair was dark and going iron at the temples. His face was hard and closed and arrestingly handsome in a way that had nothing to do with softness. A strong jaw, a stern mouth, and eyes of a grey so pale they seemed almost silver, and those eyes, when they found her across the room, did not do what men's eyes usually did. They did not flick to her figure, or her gown, or her plain unfortunate face and dismiss it. They looked at her steadily, gravely, as though she were a document he meant to read to the end, and Charlotte, who had thought herself entirely armoured, felt something turn over low in her chest. "Miss Beaumont," he said. His voice was low and even and carried without effort. "Julian Ashby. Your aunt has told you the nature of my errand, I think, so we may spare each other the pretense. This is a social call. Will you sit?" She sat. So, after a moment, did he. "You will forgive me," he said, "if I am direct. I have found that plain speaking, though it is out of fashion, saves a great deal of grief later. I am looking for a wife. Not, I will tell you honestly, for the usual reasons. I do not seek affection. I would think it a poor bargain to ask a woman to counterfeit it, and I am too old and too honest to counterfeit it myself. I seek a companion of good sense and good character to preside over my household, share my table, and, should God grant it, give me an heir. In return you would have the settled establishment, the protection of my name, an independence of your own, and my word, which I do not give lightly and have never once broken, that you would be treated at every hour with respect." The silver eyes held hers. "It is a cold offer. I make no pretty one, because I will not lie to you, Miss Beaumont, and I would rather you refuse me knowing the truth than accept me on a falsehood. Is it an offer you can consider?" Charlotte was quiet a moment. Behind the cold words she heard, or thought she heard, something she had not expected, not indifference, but a kind of scrupulous, wounded honesty, the carefulness of a man who had perhaps been lied to once, and would not build on lies again. "May I be as direct?" she asked. "I should prefer it." "Then I will tell you that I was, until 3 weeks ago, engaged to a man who threw me over for a woman with £30,000, in a manner that has made me the object of every pity in my own parish. I do not seek affection either, Mr. Ashby. I have had affection. Proved to be worth precisely £30,000 less than it claimed. I seek exactly what you describe, a house of my own, an independence, and to be spoken to, for the rest of my life, only by people who mean what they say." She lifted her chin. "You have described the one thing on earth I want. I confess it makes me suspicious. Men do not usually offer women precisely what they want. There is generally a catch. Something moved at the corner of that stern mouth, the ghost of what, in a warmer man, might have been a smile. "There is a catch," Julian Ashby said. I am reliably informed, a difficult man to live with. I am silent for days together. I do not go into society. I dislike crowds and distrust flattery, and have made rather a study of solitude. My last." He paused, and something crossed his face and was gone, too fast to read. "I have not always made those near me happy. You should know that before you decide. I offer you comfort and respect and honesty. I do not offer you gaiety or a warm house full of laughter. I am not sure I have it in me to give." "I have had a warm house full of laughter," said Charlotte. "The laughter turned out to be at my expense." She held his gaze. "I will take honesty, Mr. Ashby. I find, at 25, that I have come to prize it above almost everything." For a long moment the tall, grave man and the jilted woman looked at each other across her aunt's drawing room, and something passed between them that neither would have called by any name, a recognition, perhaps, of two people who had each been taught the same hard lesson by different teachers. "Then," said Julian Ashby, rising and offering his hand with a gravity that was almost tenderness, "will you marry me, Miss Beaumont?" And Charlotte Beaumont, who had no idea whatsoever that she was giving her hand to one of the greatest men in England, put her own into it and say will. Julian Ashby had not meant to tell her the truth about himself, and he told himself on the drive home from Ashworth that he had done nothing dishonest in withholding it. This was, he knew even as he thought it, a lie of the very kind he had promised her he would not tell. The truth was this, that Julian Ashby of Halstead was Julian Ashby Devereux, 9th Grand Duke of Halstead, a man whose name, spoken in full, made drawing rooms fall silent and mothers reach for their daughters. A man who owned the better part of 2 northern counties and held, through blood and marriage and the long patient work of his house, an influence in the councils of the kingdom that few men living could match. Halstead was not a place some way to the north. Halstead was one of the great houses of England, a palace in all but name, and he was its master, and he had spent the last 3 years since his first wife's death fleeing every consequence of being so. He had married once for the reasons dukes married, blood alliance, the joining of 2 great fortunes, and it had been a cold, glittering, miserable failure. Amelia had been beautiful and brilliant and had never for 1 hour loved him, only his coronet. She had married the Grand Duke of Halstead and been bitterly disappointed to find a mere man inside the title. She had told him so at the end, in words he still heard on bad nights, and when she died, fever, sudden, different, he had buried her with all the pomp his rank required, and had felt, standing at the graveside, chiefly a vast and shameful relief, and had despised himself for it, and had resolved that he would never again marry a woman who wanted the Grand Duke of Halstead. If he married at all, he had thought, he would find a plain, sensible woman who wanted only a home and honest dealing, and he would give her a home and honest dealing, and neither of them would pretend to a love that had nearly killed him the last time it was counterfeited. So he had gone quietly as plain Mr. Ashby to a corner of the north where his face was not known, and put out word through a discreet go-between that a widower of comfortable property sought a sensible wife. He had interviewed 3 candidates and found them wanting. And then Charlotte Beaumont had walked into her aunt's drawing room with a returned ring in her past, and a straight back and a pair of steady dark eyes that had looked at him, the man, not the fortune, for she did not know there was a fortune, and had told him to his face that she prized honesty above almost everything, and Julian Devereux had felt the ice of 3 years crack somewhere beneath him, and then he had failed at the very first hour to give her the honesty she prized. He told himself he would tell her soon. Before the wedding, certainly. Then, at the wedding, when the wedding had come and gone in a small quiet ceremony in her aunt's parish church, Charlotte in a grey silk gown, no Fanshawe and no Prescott and no pitying county for 100 miles. Only a plain marriage between Mr. Ashby and Miss Beaumont, exactly as he had promised her. He told himself he would tell her on the journey to Halstead. He did not tell her on the journey to Halstead. He could not, in the end, find the words that would not sound like the very worst kind of triumph. You thought you were marrying a modest gentleman. In fact, you have married a prince of the realm, and the longer he did not say it, the more impossible it became to say. And he watched her sit across from him in the carriage, his new wife, composed and quiet and unafraid, entirely unaware that at the end of the road lay not the snug manor she surely imagined, but a palace and a title, and a whole world of consequence she had never agreed to, and Julian Devereux, who had built his life on plain dealing, felt the falsehood sitting in his chest like a swallowed stone. Halstead came into view at dusk on the 2nd day. He watched her see it. He had positioned himself to watch her see it, out of a kind of dread. The road came up over a rise, and the valley opened below, and there it was, Halstead, half a mile of golden stone catching the last of the light, 100 windows, a lake, a park that ran to the horizon, more like a small city than a house, unmistakably, undeniably the seat of one of the first men in the kingdom. He heard Charlotte's breath stop. She turned from the window and looked at him, and he watched her understand. Mr. Ashby, she said, very carefully. What is that house? That is Halstead, said Julian. His voice did not sound like his own. You told me Halstead was a comfortable property some way to the north. I did. That, said Charlotte, is not a comfortable property. That is I do not have the word. Who lives there? And Julian Devereux, 9th Grand Duke of Halstead, looked at his wife of 2 days across the carriage and told her, at last 3 days too late, the truth. I do, he said. I am sorry, Charlotte. I have wronged you, and I knew it, and I did it anyway, and I have no defense that will satisfy either of us. My name is Julian Devereux. Ashby is a family name. It is not a lie, but it was meant to conceal one. I am the Grand Duke of Halstead. That house is mine. So are the lands you have been passing for the last hour, and rather a great many others, and— He stopped and made himself say the whole of it. A place at the King's councils, and a name that empties drawing rooms. You did not marry a modest widower. You married one of the most powerful men in England, and I let you do it without telling you, because I was a coward, and because— and here his voice, which never faltered, because the one thing I could not bear was to be married again for what I am instead of who I am. And you were the first woman in my life to look at me and see a man and not a coronet, and I could not make myself say the words that would put the coronet back between us. It was unpardonable. I do not ask you to pardon it. I ask only that you let me try, now, to be as honest with you as I promised, however late I have begun. The carriage rolled on toward the vast golden house. Charlotte Devereux, Grand Duchess of Halstead, for so she had been without knowing it, since the moment the vicar closed his book, sat very still and looked at her husband, and her face had gone white, and then it went through several things he could not name, and at last it settled into something he had not expected at all. You lied to me, she said. Yes. Who told me to my face that you prized plain dealing? Who told me you would rather I refuse you knowing the truth than accept you on a falsehood? You built the whole of your offer on that, on being the one honest man in a dishonest world, and it was itself a lie. Yes, said Julian. There was no defense. He offered none. It was. Charlotte turned and looked out at Halstead for a long moment. Then she looked back. Do you know, she said slowly, what my Mr. Fanshawe would have done in your place? He would have led with it. He would have said I am the Grand Duke of Halstead before he said good morning, and watched to see me dazzled, and married me for the pleasure of my gratitude. Her mouth twisted. You did the opposite. You hid the very thing every other man alive would have flaunted, because you wanted— God help you, to wanted for nothing but yourself, like an ordinary man, by a woman who had no reason to flatter you. She let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. It is the strangest lie I have ever been told. It is a lie told entirely against your own advantage. I do not know whether to be furious with you or to weep for you. You need not do either, said Julian low. You need only tell me what you wish. If you wish to be conveyed home to your aunt, tonight with the whole of the settlement made over to you and never to see me again, you have earned it, and I will not stop you. I have wronged you. The choice is entirely yours. Charlotte was quiet a long moment. Then, to his astonishment, she reached across the carriage and, very lightly, laid her gloved hand over his. I made a bargain, she said, with a grave, honest man who told me he could not offer me gaiety or love, only comfort and respect and truth. I find the man has rather more to offer than he let on, and rather less truth than he promised, and I am too tired and too stubborn to go home and be pitied by my aunt on top of everyone else. A flicker of something wry crossed her white face. You wanted to be married for yourself and not your coronet, Julian Devereux. Very well. I did not know there was a coronet when I said yes to you. Whatever you are, I said yes to the man in my aunt's drawing room, who looked at me as though I were worth reading to the end. I will hold you to being him, and you will spend, I think, a very long time earning back the honesty you spent tonight. Julian Devereux looked down at the small gloved hand on his, and at the woman it belonged to, and felt something in his chest that he had believed died 3 years ago at a graveside, and that he now suspected, with a kind of vertigo, had merely been waiting all this time for someone to look at him and see a man. I will spend the rest of my life earning it, he said. See that you do, said the Grand Duchess of Halstead, and turned back to the window to watch her impossible new home draw near. The rebound marriage of convenience became, over the slow turning of that first winter at Halstead, something neither of them had bargained for. It did not happen quickly. Julian would not have believed it if it had. It happened the way ice go off a lake, imperceptibly at the edges first, so that a man does not notice the thaw until one day he finds open water where he had walked all winter. Charlotte took to Halstead as though she had been born to it, which surprised everyone but Julian, who by now expected to be surprised by nothing she did. She was not dazzled by it. That was the thing. Amelia had loved the state of the place, the bowing servants, the deference, the glitter, had drunk it like wine and always wanted more. Charlotte treated the palace exactly as she had told Julian she would treat a house, whatever its size, as a thing to be understood and cared for, and when necessary, corrected. She learned the servants' names within a month and their troubles within 2. She found in the vast neglected muddle of the household books economies that made his steward blink. She reopened the great library, which Amelia had thought dull, and Julian, coming home cold and silent from a long day among his tenants, took to finding his wife curled in a window seat with 3 books and a candle, and took to sitting down across from her, and took, slowly, over that winter, to talking to her. He had not talked to anyone in years. He discovered he had a great deal saved up. She listened the way she did everything, gravely, wholly, without flattery, and with a dry sideways wit that ambushed him again and again into the unfamiliar sound of his own laughter. She argued with him, fearlessly, on politics, on the management of the estate, on the education of the village children, on whether his favourite poet was a genius or a bore, and Julian, who had spent his whole life among people too frightened of his rank to disagree with him, found the experience of being contradicted by his own wife to be, of all things, a kind of intoxication. She did not fear him. She had married the man before she knew the coronet, and she never once, in all the winter, treated him as anything but the man. And Julian Devereux, who had built a fortress against ever being loved for the wrong reasons, felt himself, day by day, in the gravest danger of being loved for the right ones, and of returning it in full and terrible measure. He watched her sleep, once, in the library, the candle guttered. 3 books slid to the floor, and he stood over her a long time and did not wake her, and understood, standing there, that he was entirely and hopelessly in love with his wife, and that he had not the smallest idea whether the woman he had won by lying to her felt anything for him beyond the loyalty of a bargain kept. He did not touch her. He had told her, that first night at Halstead, that he asked nothing of her she did not freely give, that the marriage was hers to make real or leave a courtesy, in her own time or nedet. He had said that he owed her for the falsehood, and would honour if it took a lifetime. She had looked at him with those steady dark eyes and thanked him, and so he waited through the long thaw of the winter, watching the ice go off the lake of her, not daring to hope, not daring to name the thing that grew. It was the spring that decided it, the spring and Henry Fanshawe. For the world, of course, had learned by then who Charlotte had married. It could not stay hidden. A Grand Duchess of Halstead cannot be kept a secret, and when the news reached the county Charlotte had fled, the news that the jilted Beaumont girl, past her bloom, pitied at every tea-table, had married not a modest widower but the Grand Duke of Halstead himself, one of the first men in England. The effect was, Julian gathered from his wife's dry account of the letters she received, very much like a stone dropped into a still pond. Aunt Mercer wrote 3 times a week. Old acquaintances who had not troubled to condole with Charlotte in her disgrace now wrote effusively to congratulate her in her triumph, and Henry Fanshawe, who had thrown her over for £30,000, who was by now safely and expensively married to his heiress and, by all accounts, already regretting it, Henry Fanshawe contrived that spring to be presented to the Grand Duke and Duchess of Halstead at a great assembly in the north, so that he might, before the whole glittering room, congratulate his former betrothed on her astonishing good fortune. Julian was standing beside his wife when the man came up. He did not know at first who Fanshawe was. Charlotte had told him the story but not the name. But he felt her very still beside him, that particular stillness he had learned to read, the bracing of a struck creature that will not flinch, and he saw the smooth, comfortable, faintly regretful young man bowing over her hand and heard him say, with an oily, wounded gallantry, "Your Grace." Or, Charlotte, dare I still, I hardly know how to address such magnificence. How well fortune has treated you. Who could have foreseen it? When I think that I once had the honor of your promise and let it slip, a rueful, self-forgiving smile, I confess I am the greatest fool in England, and I own it freely. You will laugh at me, I know. You cannot imagine how often I have reproached myself. And Julian understood, in the space of a breath, exactly who this was. He watched his wife lift her chin. He watched her prepare to answer this creature with the cool, level dignity she brought to everything, to give him no doubt some perfectly civil, perfectly cutting reply and turn away. And Julian found that, for once, he did not wish her to have to. He found that he was tired of watching her bear things alone with her head up. He found that a slow, cold, entirely unfamiliar fury had risen in him at the sight of the man who had thrown Charlotte away like a spent glove and now stood simpering at her side, angling for the reflected warmth of the very fortune he had been too shallow to see he was refusing. So the Grand Duke of Halstead did a thing he had not done in company in living memory. He spoke first. "You must be Mr. Fanshawe," he said. His voice was quiet and pleasant, and it fell across the noise of the room like the shadow of a great building, and people nearby turned. "My wife has told me of you. You are the gentleman who was betrothed to her, I think, and who broke it off, for a Miss Prescott, was it, and £30,000. Fanshawe's smile stiffened. "Your Grace, that is a rather blunt way of, one had obligations." "You had obligations," Julian agreed gravely. "So one gathers. To £30,000. He let a silence fall, the terrible unhurried silence he had spent a lifetime learning to deploy, and watched the man begin to sweat in it. "I find I owe you a debt, Mr. Fanshawe, a considerable one. I have thought, once or twice this winter, of how it came about that a woman of my wife's quality, her wit, her sense, her courage, her honor, none of which, I perceive, you ever troubled to notice, came to be free to marry me, and the answer, of course, is you. You looked at the finest woman in 3 counties, and you weighed her against a bank draft, and you chose the bank draft. It is the single most fortunate act of my life. I could not have arranged it better had I paid you. So I thank you." His pale eyes rested on the man with a cold and perfect courtesy. "And now, having thanked you, I think we need not detain you further. The Duchess and I are engaged. Good evening." It was annihilation, and it was done without a raised voice, and the whole corner of the room had heard it. Henry Fanshawe bowed, jerkily scarlet to the ears, and made his escape into the crowd, and there was a soft, delighted murmur behind fans as the tan all ready to spread, and Julian Devereux turned from watching him go to find his wife staring at him. She was not composed. For once, for the first time he had ever seen, Charlotte's careful composure had entirely deserted her. Her dark eyes were very bright, and her mouth was trembling, and she was looking at him as though she had just seen him, truly seen him for the very first time. "Julian," she said, low, unsteady, "you did not have to do that." "No," he agreed. "I wanted to. There is a difference. I have discovered it lately living with you. It is a thing I did not know before." He looked down at her. "You have spent your whole life lifting your head and bearing things alone, Charlotte, because no one ever stood beside you and made them stop. I find I cannot bear to watch you do it any longer. I find I would rather stand between you and every Henry Fanshawe in England for the rest of my life than watch you square your shoulders and endure one more of them alone." His voice dropped, only for her, in the middle of the glittering crowd. "I love you. I did not mean to. I had sworn off it. It nearly destroyed me once. But I love you, and I have loved you since some grey afternoon in a library when you fell asleep over 3 books and I could not make myself wake you. And I have been afraid to tell you because you married me on a bargain and by a lie, and I had no rights for more than the bargain. I am asking now, not the coronet, Charlotte, not Halstead, the man, the one you said yes to in your aunt's drawing-room. He loves you past all sense, and would very much like to know whether there is any hope on earth that you might, in time, come to love him back." For a moment Charlotte, Grand Duchess of Halstead, could not speak at all. Then she laughed, a wet, breaking, wholly undignified laugh, the laugh of a woman whose careful armor has fallen all at once to the floor, and she caught his hand in both of hers, there in the middle of the assembly, in full view of everyone who had ever pitied her, and she said, "In time?" "In time," you dreadful, honorable, impossible man. I have loved you since the night you told me the truth about Halstead in that carriage, when any other man alive would have watched me be dazzled, and you only sat there wretched with wanting to be loved for yourself. I have loved you through the whole of a winter and been too proud and too frightened to say it, because you told me you had nothing to offer but comfort and truth, and I thought I would die before I let you know how much more I wanted. She pressed his hand hard against her heart. I did not marry you for what you are, Julian Devereux. I did not know what you were. I married the man and I love him. I have loved the man all along. Julian Devereux, 9th Grand Duke of Halstead, stood in the middle of a crowded assembly with his wife's hands crushed against his heart and his careful, guarded, 3 years frozen self coming apart in the warm light, and he did the second thing he had not done in company in living memory. He smiled fully, helplessly, a smile that transformed the whole stern face and made a dowager across the room drop her fan, and he lifted his wife's hand and pressed his mouth to it, slowly, before all of them, a public and unmistakable declaration from a man famous for making none. They left the assembly soon after. There seemed no reason to stay, and in the years that followed, the long, warm, full years, with the great house no longer cold, and children's voices at last in the halls Amelia had thought dull, and a Grand Duchess whom the whole North came to love for her plain dealing and her dry wit and her fierce care of her people, Julian Devereux would sometimes think of the strange road that had brought her to him, of a shallow man weighing a woman against a bank draught and choosing the draught, of a jilting in a shabby drawing-room 100 miles south that had felt to Charlotte like the end of everything and had been, in truth, the beginning of the only thing that ever mattered. He never did feel much gratitude to Henry Fanshawe, in the end, whatever he had said that night. A man cannot be grateful to a fool for throwing away a treasure he was too blind to see. But he was grateful every day of his life that the treasure had come north, and that when a grave cold man had offered her nothing but honesty and a home, she had looked at him with her steady dark eyes and, seeing the man before she ever saw the coronet, said, "I will."